Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endures forever. Welcome to Faith Matters with Philip Campbell. This is a Catholic variety program broadcasting on Good Shepherd Catholic Radio out of Jackson, Michigan. And I am your host, Philip Campbell. I'm going to be the voice on the other end for the next half hour, and very happy that once again you're tuning in with us today on the Faith Matters program. My friends, one of the most universal experiences that we share as Catholics is going to church. Whether you're a Catholic in the United States or whether you're in Asia or somewhere in Africa or in one of the great cathedrals of Europe, this is something that all Catholics have in common, at least if you're practicing, as I hope you are. Every Sunday, and I should say throughout the week, millions and millions of Catholics worldwide go to Mass to hear the gospel read, to hear the preaching of the Word of God, and to receive our Lord in Holy Communion. It's just a very universal experience of Catholic life, shuffling off to Mass on Sunday at the local church. But have we ever stopped to ask ourselves, what is a church exactly? How do we define what constitutes a church building versus, say, a secular meeting space like a city hall or an auditorium? The question might seem simple, almost deceptively simple, until we dig into it a bit. And that's what I want to talk about in this episode is the concept of the church as a sacred space. What makes a church different than a city hall or an auditorium? Is it the fact that people worship God there? If that's the difference, that people worship God, then what makes the church different than, say, my living room, where we also worship God? Because you can get family members together in the living room and we can say prayers and we can sing and we can worship God in the living room. And if God is omnipresent, why does it matter where I worship Him? After all, God is just as present in the woods or in the shower as He is in a special church building, right? And I guess if there's no satisfactory answers to any of this, then why bother worshiping God in a special building at all? Maybe as we move further into the future, church buildings will become entirely superfluous. But of course, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves here, because one of the first things you learn in philosophy is that before you can proceed with any inquiry, we must start by defining our terms. What does the term church mean? Or to put this another way, in a more specific Catholic context, what do Catholics understand a church building to be? Now, how one answers this question gives tremendous insight into how one views Catholicism in general. For example, suppose I were to say, well, the church, it's just a building for like-minded people to get together and do their thing. It's a place where people who think and believe the same can associate. Okay, that is something akin to a building like say the Elks Club or a Masonic Lodge or the clubhouse of a biker gang, right? Essentially a place where people who have a like-minded vision can get together to do their thing. And if I were to say that, then essentially I'm saying that the church as a building is essentially no different than a social club. Now, on the other hand, suppose I were to say, well, it's more than just like-minded people gathering. The church is a gathering space for the people of God to worship God. Now, we get closer to the truth with this, but this is a little bit too functional, as if church buildings only exist because of the incidental fact that we need large facilities to accommodate crowds. As if the church building would be unnecessary if our numbers were fewer, or as if the building receives its essential character just because people congregate there. Again, this would make the church building no different than a school gymnasium that a congregation rents for a prayer service. And there are people out there that think of church buildings in this way, that they're merely functional. They're merely occasions for the people of God to get together and worship. But if we think that way, it shows that our view of Catholicism is very functional. It's very utilitarian. And when we focus too narrowly on something's function or its usefulness, We blind ourselves to the other levels of meaning that things hold. Because a thing is not defined solely by its utility. Imagine what people would think of me if I were to, someone asked, "Oh, you've been best friends with John for 25 years. What do you like about him?" And I just went on about how useful he is. Well, he's very handy. When something breaks, I call my buddy and he fixes my car. And I just go on about his utility. You would think I had a very shallow view of my friend if I was defining him simply by how useful he happens to be. Because, of course, there's many other levels of meaning besides something's utility. Well, let me cut to the point and state my thesis that a Christian church is essentially a sacred space. A Christian church is essentially a sacred space. Now, this might seem like common sense, but in fact, contemporary thought has largely rejected the concept of the sacred, and unfortunately, you see this even within the Catholic fold. There's a great book by the Catholic Thomist philosopher Joseph Pieper, which is published under Ignatius Press, called In Search of the Sacred, and it's a collection of his essays on the subject of the sacred, sacred buildings, the priesthood, the concept of the sacred. It's a really nice little book. Doesn't take very long to read, but it's very insightful. And in his chapter on church buildings, Pieper tells the story of a Catholic architect that he met in the 1960s in Germany, who vehemently opposed any sense of the sacred in church architecture. He said he wanted to obliterate the distinction between the sacred and the profane. This architect told Pieper that he wanted church buildings to feel so normal that people would feel comfortable even eating sausages inside the sanctuary. The guy was German, so he picked sausages. If he was American, maybe we would say bacon or French fries or something like that. But you get the point. He wanted individuals to feel so normal inside the church that they'd feel comfortable just munching on a sausage in the sanctuary. Now, most of us Catholics would feel probably a bit uncomfortable with this. Our idea of the church as a sacred place would make us feel that certain behaviors were, how should we say, inappropriate, maybe? Eating sausages, skateboarding, throwing darts, right? You can think of all sorts of things. Most of us would, even if we couldn't articulate why, most of us would feel like that church just isn't the place for these activities. Well, why not? God doesn't hate sausages. There's nothing evil about skateboarding. It's not a mortal sin to throw darts, right? Why would you object to these things other than mere custom? I mean, I understand it's not custom to eat in church, but I mean, why can't you? There's nothing wrong with eating a sausage, right? Well, no, of course not. Of course, there's nothing wrong or sinful about riding a skateboard or throwing a dart or eating a sausage, but these things are not inappropriate because they are bad or because they are evil, but I think the crux of the matter is that we have different standards for what is permitted inside the church than what we do out in the workaday world. And this gets to the real heart of what it means to say that something is sacred or that the church is a sacred place. This division, this separateness between what occurs inside the sacred place and what is expected outside the sacred place. Whether we are looking at the Latin word sacra, which is where we get the word sacred, or the Hebrew kadosh, the concept of something being sacred or holy means to be set apart. Okay, set apart. And the word holy and sacred are very similar. In Latin, we say sanctus is the translation for holy, right? Holy, sacred, very similar idea. The meaning of being set apart. That's what it means to be sacred. That's what it means when something is holy. When we say we have holy water, this is water that is set apart for a very particular use. That's the meaning of the word consecrate. If you think of the word consecrate, it's to make sacred, to devote or dedicate or set apart. Now, to set apart from what? What are we setting it apart from? Well, it's not what we're setting it apart from. Rather, it is what we set something apart for. When something is set apart or consecrated, like let's say a church, It is set apart from the concerns and the uses of the workaday world, and it's devoted to the service of God. So when you're consecrating something or making something sacred, consecrating a sacred space, it's being set apart for the service of God. Think about something like, like let's say I have a big stone table, okay, like a nice big granite stone table. There's all sorts of things I can do on a big nice stone table, right? I can spread my bills out on it. I can, lay junk on it. I can throw flour on it, make a pizza. If I have a nice marble slab, I can make fudge on it if you know how to do that. There's all sorts of things we can do with like a big marble or a granite table. But let's say we install that in a church, and let's say we put some relics in it, and let's say the bishop consecrates it. My friends, that is no longer a table. That's no longer a table for any regular usage. That becomes an altar. It's set apart for the service of God. And to continue to treat that item as if it was just any other piece of furniture to do normal everyday things on, that now becomes inappropriate because we're in the sacred space now. Things are devoted to the service of God. Outside, we concern ourselves with the cares of the world, with bills and fudge. But within the sacred precincts, our minds are lifted to matters divine, and only those things which befit divine worship are permitted within. Things that elevate our minds and our hearts to God. This is why the old cathedrals were so tall, were so vertical. They wanted the worshiper to elevate their mind and their heart to God by physically elevating their eyes and admiring the great spaces that were exemplified with the vertical towers of the church, the great spires. We are, of course, material beings, and we often approach the divine through material objects, through sense-perceptible things. There was a saying in philosophy, nothing in the mind that is not first in the senses. Everything you know about the world you apprehend through your eyes, through your mouth, your sense of touch. It's through our sense perception that we form our concepts of reality, and then our mind abstracts. We start to figure out how to make abstract ideas, but we get our basic data about the world from our senses, and so it makes sense. You see, I did a pun there. It makes sense that we have holy things that pertain to our senses, that we approach the divine through material things. Hence we have holy water, right? Water that is set aside for holy uses. We have votive candles. We have sacred bells. We have incense. We have ritual gestures. We have sacred music, sacred vestments, and all these wonderful things that help us understand, experience, and express our faith in very concrete terms. We even have sacred people, right? I'm talking about those who are consecrated with holy orders. Not sacred in the sense that every consecrated person is personally holy. We know that's a matter of a person's individual choices. But remember, sacred in the sense of set apart. A consecrated person, a priest, is set apart for the service of God. His hands are consecrated specially and set apart for the administration of the sacraments. A priest is supposed to live a life set apart from the concerns of the regular world. So we are beings who experience reality in terms of time and space, and so we have sacred times and sacred spaces, right? These are the basics of our reality: time, space. And so we have sacred time, sacred spaces. If you consider sacred time, we have all these great liturgical feasts in the calendar of the church. And that's why also on the most solemn feast days, why we abstain from work and we celebrate. Why? Not just because the church decided we need a break. Like, all right, it's Easter Sunday. You slobs need a break from work, so we'll give you a day off. It's not merely utilitarian. It's because this day is not like other days, and so we do not observe it like other days. On most days we work, we labor, we sweat for our daily bread, but on these solemn days we rest and we celebrate because The day is not like other days. It's sacred. This is why even in Judaism, in the Passover Seder, an integral part of the Passover ritual is typically the youngest child in the family will ask, why is tonight different from all other nights? And then the saving acts of God through the Passover narrative are recited. So sacred time through our sacred feasts, but then also sacred space. So just like we set apart time for observing the sacred, we set apart space. And for us, this is going to mean the church, of course, the parish, but also Catholic cemeteries, chapels, or any other places set apart. You might have a place set apart in your home for special devotions. I have a table in my house with a crucifix and some holy statues and candles, and it's just a table I bought. I ordered online, but once I put the candles on it and the sacred statues, it's not an ordinary table. I don't put my cereal bowl on it when I'm done eating. It's restricted for holy uses. Now, even in paganism, you see sacred areas are set apart by some kind of boundary. If you've ever been to Stonehenge, and I was fortunate to go to Stonehenge many years ago, Stonehenge was originally surrounded by a ditch and a fence that set apart the sacred precincts. The Romans had two gods, Janus and Terminus, and Janus was the god of doorways and transitions and movements from one state to another. Janus is this two-faced god that looks both ways on the sides of a door. He's also the god that was commemorated at the New Year. We get the name January from Janus because he's looking back to the previous year and forward to the New Year. And they had this other god, Terminus, that was the god of boundaries, because the boundary between two spaces, especially a sacred space and a profane space, was thought to be a mystical spot that needed the special protection of this deity, Terminus. So the idea of sacred space is not unique to Catholicism. Even in pagan religions, you see that sacred areas are set off by special boundaries, special markers, where different expectations, different rules of behavior are enforced within the sacred space. It's just part of human nature because of our nature as human beings who encounter things through our senses. To encounter the divine, we carve out pieces of time and space that are set aside, and these pieces of time and space become points of divine encounter. Now, to go back to the question of what makes a church, it seems evident that in light of these reflections, that within the sacred space of the church, we should be prepared to encounter God. And an encounter with God is always something that transcends the workaday world. It's extraordinary. Encountering God is an extraordinary thing. In the Old Testament, they called it a theophany, when God appears, like when he appeared to Abraham in the form of the three young men, or when he appears to Moses in the burning bush. It's something extraordinary, and it's because this is so that we establish our sacred spaces. There's a theory going around that if we want to keep people in the Catholic Church, if we want to keep people coming to our parishes, we need to desacralize them. That is, we need to make, the reason people don't come to church is because they don't feel comfortable there. And they will feel more comfortable if we bring in the everyday elements from the outside world. If we bring those outside elements into the church, then people will feel more comfortable because they'll feel more at home, right? If we were to perhaps dress the same way we do out in the world, if we were to bring in all our little gadgets, if we were to have decor in the church that looked more akin to what we would see in our houses, that maybe people would feel better in church and we could keep them. But I think if we bring in elements from the outside world, there's really no meaningful difference between within and without anymore. The distinction between the sacred space and the outside world is obliterated, and perhaps we would feel comfortable, so comfortable that we would kick our feet up and eat sausages, as the German architect said. But is that really what Catholic worship is all about? Such an idea does obliterate the idea of the church as a special place where we encounter God in a special way. And while that might not be too problematic for certain sects of Christianity, I'm thinking of certain Protestant sects where pretty much the worship is centered on the sermon that could in theory take place anywhere, I guess. But in the Catholic faith, our central act of worship is the Holy Eucharist, which the Catechism says is the source and summit of the Christian faith. We literally have Jesus Christ present on the altar, body, blood, soul, and divinity. It is the supreme sacrifice of the Christian faith, and as such, Catholic worship, it's very different from what you see in other brands of Christianity. It's deeply intrinsically tied to this exceptional encounter with God, this eruption of the divine into our world in the Blessed Sacrament. And so we cannot so easily dispense with the concept of the sacred as our Protestant friends. In the town I used to live, there was I guess you'd call it a megachurch. These are a thing now. These big churches where they'll have they have a playground inside and a soccer field and a coffee shop and like a movie theater and all these things for recreation. The idea is to get people in there. Like if I have all these recreational things, people will come in and then they can be exposed to the gospel, etc. And I understand that that's their way of doing things, but the Catholics cannot really adopt this sort of idea as easily as Protestants can, at least not without compromising something very essential about what it means to be Catholic, the centrality of the holy sacrifice of the Mass and the Eucharist. Because you see, in the Eucharist, not only does the divine emerge in the midst of our sacred space, it is the reason for the sacred space. It's the reason that sacred space exists. In the book I mentioned earlier, In Search of the Sacred, Pieper mentions a barn in Zagreb, Croatia, during World War II that was converted into a church for Catholic soldiers. But it's very interesting. The way they converted it into a church, they didn't just say, well, it doesn't matter where we have church, anywhere will do. Let's just go into that barn to get out of the rain. No, the barn was solemnly consecrated with all the proper rites, with the prayers and the sprinkling of holy water, and solemn consecration as a sacred space. And after its consecration, it was no longer a mere barn. It was no longer used as a barn. It became a sacred space, set apart for divine worship by the rites of the church. This reminds me of the St. Joseph's Shrine in Grass Lake here in Jackson County, which of course literally used to be a barn, but then it was converted into a church. It still retains its original barn-like structure, but obviously it's been refitted for divine worship. But yeah, a sacred space, the Domus Dei, the house of God, God's house, the house of the Lord, or as the temple is referred to in the Old Testament, thy house, thy dwelling place. So really, we're not talking about what a church needs to look like in an aesthetic sense. You know, in a pinch, a barn can become a church, right? Although, of course, however we decorate a church, it should be in such a way that elevates our hearts toward the contemplation of the divine in a manner fitting with the majesty of God. But ultimately what I'm getting at here is about our understanding of why churches exist, what it means to have a sacred space, to carve out that little piece of the world, that little piece of space and time, and say, yes, in the world I am busy with many things, as Martha was, right? I'm busy with cleaning and paying the bills and doing all this stuff. But here in these sacred precincts, I lift my eyes unto you, oh my God, because this is where we encounter the divine. What it means to have a sacred space. How can we turn our church experience into that encounter with the divine it is meant to be? And incidentally, this is why also we have a sin called sacrilege. The sin of sacrilege is when you take consecrated things and put them to common use, put them to profane uses. So, for example, if I take holy water that has been blessed and is set apart as holy water, and I dump it in my pot and I use it to boil rice with, okay, that could be construed as an act of sacrilege. Why? Is boiling rice evil? No. The profane is not evil. We have the sacred and the profane, but what is profane is not evil. It's just not fitting for the use of sacred objects that have been set apart. This is why, and this is the last thing I promise, but this is fascinating. If I strike somebody, if I punch someone unprovoked, I commit a sin. I commit a sin of anger, of striking my brother. But if I strike a priest, I commit an additional sin on top of that, I commit the sin of sacrilege, because not only am I striking a person, but I'm putting a consecrated object to profane use. That is, I'm profaning the priest by striking him. So to hit a priest is worse than to hit someone who is not consecrated, because it's a sacrilege. Things are set apart for the worship of God, my friends. This is how we interact with the world. We are material beings, and this is the way God has ordained it. So let's keep this in mind, why we have sacred spaces, why we have churches, and that when we cross into that portal, into the sanctuary, we're crossing into sacred space, into sacred time, to have an encounter with that same God who appeared to Moses. So, very good reflections, but that's about all the time we have for today. So until next time, this has been Faith Matters with Phillip Campbell. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you, be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. God bless you, my friends.